Okay, so why don't we start? Again, it's so wonderful to be here with all of you in this virtual space. Many of you know me, but just in case, my name is Crystal Munhebek, and I am an associate professor at UC Riverside in the Gender and Sexuality Studies Department, and I'm joining you actually right now from the unceded lands of the Tongva people, also known as the San Gabriel Valley, which is part of Los Angeles and about 50 miles east of Riverside. So I reside here with my family. So before we start, I just want to thank the folks who made this event possible. And this is, as I'll share in a little bit, this event has been long in the making. So I want to thank my department, Gender and Sexuality Studies, just for all their support this past year, and also the Center for Ideas in Society, who, which is really the institution that made this event possible in different ways, from funding to also helping organize this event. And in particular, I want to thank Bianca Lopez, who's here and providing some back-end support, Catherine Henshaw, Dylan Rodriguez, and Jessica DeFilippo. And also just for the administrative staff that has also supported this process in relation to our department, including Angela Cherry and Irene Dotson. So I know we're all Zoom experts by now, but just as a just as a heads up, please do keep your mics muted if you're part of the audience. But please feel free to use the chat. I actually love that there's sort of this parallel way for us to be in conversation. And while I might not be able to track it during, while we're speaking, I will definitely do my best to sort of read as we sort of transition into a conversation with all of you, which we're really looking forward to doing. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. The event, as you know, is titled Aural Notes. Oral, so listening, sensing, thinking about sound other than also just, verbal language. So oral notes from the margins, community solidarities, radical memory work, and other ways of knowing. And, a few of us were talking before the event started today, and today's May 15th, and I want to recognize that today is a 76th year anniversary or commemoration of the Nakba, which is an Arabic word for catastrophe, and this marks the catastrophic displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians from their land and homes in 1948. And this is a devastation that has been a devastating process that has been continuing for the past 7 decades. And of course, in terms of the past 7 months, of thousands and thousands of Palestinians who have been killed, displaced from their homes. I know for me, and I've been in conversation with many of you, I've been really deeply impacted by what has unfolded, the past several months. And I think it's really in relationship to in conversation with the kind of work that we've all been doing in terms of the folks in this group, from our specific locations. I've been thinking a lot about, what is quote unquote radical memory work, right? What do we mean by radical? And, if you sort of look up radical, radical means by the roots, right? So you're taking something by the roots rather than sort of cosmetic engagement. So, what does it mean to think about memory work as a form of, taking something by the roots, but also reestablishing, right? And then, I think in relationship to sort of radical memory work, the questions I've been thinking about is, what does it mean when literal infrastructure is being destroyed, right? So when universities are being bombed and destroyed, right? There are no more universities right now in Gaza. Other places of gathering and learning are being destroyed, when memory keepers, teachers, writers, librarians, artists are being assassinated, and when there are entire, familial lineages and generations that are, being murdered, right? So it's a series of questions that I've been really very emotional about and thinking quite a bit about. And this is something that I'll share later on. And I know I was sharing this with our group. There is going to be an initiative, based, and it's supported by the the UC Humanities Research Institute, or the UCHRI, which I'll be involved with. It's an initiative that really brings together scholars, writers, artists, organizers, seat keepers, librarians, archivists, memory stewards, knowledge holders across 6 UC campuses and beyond, right? Who will be sort of engaging with these questions around memory and working with, learning from, supporting memory workers who are living, in war zones and conflict zones. So with that said, I thought that would just could be a framing and a segue into I know what will be a really rich, multifaceted, nourishing conversation. Um, just for some context, this virtual roundtable conversation, includes participants, really dear friends, colleagues, comrades, from a group that we've informally sort of called Beyond Best Practices. And we'll sort of, everyone will have a chance through questions, through engaging with each other, and also with all of you about the kind of memory work we've been doing, which includes, community-centered storytelling, oral history, but also other kinds of memory work, and also imaginative archival work. So this group, who you'll meet all of them in a minute, includes oral historians, interdisciplinary scholars, educators, archivists, writers, editors, DJs, who first came together, around 2021, 2022, in part to be in conversation with one another about the kind of work that we're doing within institutional context and maybe some of the challenges that we've been sort of navigating, and what it might mean to be in community with each other in ways that are not about being part of a formal institution per se, right? What does that lend itself to? Originally one of the first people that I had been in conversation with about a sort of early iteration of this group is Fanny Garcia, who is here. I had known Fanny for a little bit because we both graduated from Columbia's program, a master's program in oral history. And through different kinds of discussions and collaborations, I think we met in Salt Lake City at a conference. Now I'm forgetting the year; it might have been 2018, 2019, but pre-pandemic. And we were just sort of talking about the different challenges that we had faced within the institutions that we're a part of, whether it's the university or larger associations like the Oral History Association or the American Studies Association, and sort of other kinds of spaces. And we just started to be in deeper conversation around the different practices and ethical considerations that, at least at that time, wasn't being extensively discussed, at least within public spaces, right? Folks were talking about them within, more private spaces, but not, as much publicly. So we were thinking a lot about, what does consent mean or look like in ways that might depart from how we've been taught to think about and practice consent, as a kind of legal process. Is it possible to engage with oral history when audio recordings aren't made, right? Or when they're not at the center of the kind of work that we're doing? How do we both honor, but also, think about questions related to openness, access, right? Quote unquote, discovery of oral histories, right? And there are ways in which I think some people, our participants today will talk about how, particular stories belong within particular communities, right? And there are these long histories, of course, of settler extraction, of colonialism, in which these stories have been exploited. Um, and I sort of met, people in this group in different ways. I think Trey Adcock, who's here, I met you at a digital pedagogy conference years ago in Vancouver. I don't even remember the year. Matt Le, who is just one of my most brilliant students I had at UC Riverside, and is now a dear friend and collaborator. Ella and also Dow, who are part of a Voice of Witness, who are here. And now I'm forgetting how exactly I met both of you, but I think maybe it might have been through Fanny, actually, sort of introductions. Rochelle, I think we were part of a different oral history project during the height of the pandemic with Asian American, also Pacific Islander communities. And Nikki, I've known about your work for a while, and I think I had a colleague who attended grad school with you, but I actually found out more about your work, I think also through Fanny. And so it's just such a pleasure to be in community with all of you. So today we're just going to be in deep conversation about the kind of work we've been doing to share lessons, ask questions, collectively problem solve, the kinds of conversations we've been having. And this past year, we've actually been meeting almost on a monthly basis virtually. And at the beginning of our group, it was a little bit more structured, right? There are specific questions that we want to answer and specific readings we want to do, but that didn't quite feel right? We didn't just want another space where it would be an obligation, but we really wanted to try our best to create a community that, um, felt, for the lack of better words, nourishing, but also rigorous, where we could really, ask each other these difficult questions and share some of the experiences that we've been having as memory workers who also, I think in different ways, have been holding really difficult stories, right? So how do we do this work? So some of the questions that we've been thinking about throughout the year and that will be in conversation with all of you today is, what does community-centered memory work mean to us? What does it feel, look, sound like? Who are the peoples and communities that we're in relationship with? How has our situated and local work shaped, changed, or challenged the ways that we've been trained or taught to do memory work, whether it's archival work, oral history work, writing? And what are the critical practices, principles, and ethical orientations that are really important to us, right? And what other ways of knowing have emerged? So I'm going to segue now into doing introductions, but we thought that rather than me introducing everyone, folks could actually just briefly introduce yourselves. Maybe name, pronoun, your location. And if this feels, if you're open to this, maybe one thing that you want to share in regards to, what is the one question that you've been waking up with? What is something that has kept you up at night? What is a question or a thought that has stayed with you, right? And we're just going to go into alphabetical order, if that's okay, by last name. So Trey, if it's okay, I'm going to start with you.
Well, Shionagad, Chedogdo, Kalieliga Jigawata, Jalgi Ayeli Aya, Tokiasti Gea. So hey everybody, I'm Trey. I'm really honored to be here with you all, grateful to be here, particularly with all the panelists. It's pretty humbling to be a part of it and grateful to be a part of it. I am a Cherokee Nation citizen living in our ancestral lands, Jaligi Uweti, most specifically Asheville, North Carolina, or what we refer to as the place where they race. My 13th year at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. I'm not sure if I'll make it to the 14th year, but I'm my 13th year. I'm also the executive director of a nonprofit, the Center for Native Health, which is based on the Qualla boundary of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, where most of my work occurs. And the one question that has been sticking with me is I have a 13-year-old daughter at home. And so I think I wake up every morning, just how can I be a support system for her? How can I be the best dad possible for her? How can I love her the best I can? So that's what I struggle with.
Thank you so much, Trey, for sharing that. I'm going to shift to Ella Banerjee.
Thanks, Crystal, and thank you to CIS. Thank you for having all of us. Really happy to be here. I'm Ella Banerjee. I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling from Ohlone Land, also known as Berkeley, California, and I'm the Community Partnership Manager at Voice of Witness, also known as VOW, and we're an oral history nonprofit. We work on and develop and publish narrative projects, as well as education projects and community partnership projects that focus on different social justice and human rights issues on a number of topics, but particularly around migration and displacement and the criminal justice and carceral system in the US. And something I've been thinking about a lot is how, we can engage in acts, both like quote unquote big and quote unquote small, to connect us to each other, and to, global events and, collective pain we're all feeling, but also collective joys. So what are the ways that we can process like the things that are very big, but also the ways in like even everyday life that we can kind of also connect and process all of those things and be in community with each other. So just thinking about different scales of ways that we can act. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ella. So I'm going to shift to Fanny Garcia.
Hello, everyone. My name's Fanny Julissa Garcia. I was born in Honduras, raised in Mexico, and in California, where I just got back from a wonderful, nourishing visit. But I live in Lenapehoking, which is Harlem, New York. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the project director for Separated, Stories of Injustice and Solidarity, which documents the stories of families that were separated at the US-Mexico border under the Trump administration. I'm also an immigration justice advocate, and I do a lot of that work, including recently working for the city, helping new immigrants apply for asylum. And one thing that I've been kind of thinking about a lot lately is, how do I pause, hold off, go slowly into what I've been taught to do in academia, which is to contextualize and interpret and analyze the words of narrators to present to various audiences. And how do I do that in a gentle and ethical way without imposing my own views on someone's story? So that's what I'm grappling with right now.
Thank you so much, Fanny. So Rochelle Kwan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Always love being in this group. I am Rochelle Kwan. Some people also know me as you. I use she, her pronouns, and I wear many, many hats. I lead a project called Chinatown Records, where I have been bringing together music and oral history, based here in Manhattan's Chinatown, and inheriting family record collections from my family, neighbors, friends from all across the country, and using that as a starting point for oral histories. I also work with community groups like Think Chinatown and Self-Evident to produce oral history, teach oral history workshops, specifically within community spaces. And all in tandem with that, I'm also a DJ, an artist, and a lot of the questions that I've been thinking about have been, how can we make all of these things that I'm doing, from oral history to teaching to talking to our elders, how can we make it fun? How can we use music to act as this portal that so many of us can relate to and lead us to these conversations? So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. So Mads Liv.
Hi everyone. My name is Mads. I don't use pronouns, so just my name. Yeah, I'm currently at UCLA's Information Studies. I'm currently a PhD candidate there, working on figuring out my project, I think now. And also I'm the Viet Rainbow Orange County Board Chair. Viet Rainbow Orange County is a local Vietnamese and Southeast Asian, or kind of broadly BIPOC youth-based organization known Orange County, is looking to support youth-based education and advocacy work in Orange County. And yeah, I think most of my work currently, and which I will talk about a little bit about later, is more so lately thinking about Vietnamese oral histories and illness specifically, particularly with likely nail salon workers. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Mads. And Dao Tran.
Hi, everyone. I am Dao. I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling today from Canarsie and Lenape land, also known as Brooklyn. I was born in Vietnam, and I like to say, but I was made here in the USA. I work at Voice of Witness. I'm the editorial director there. And I'm also on the editorial board of Haymarket Books. So I love when, that work can kind of blend, overlap, come together. Some things that have been keeping me up, if I'm being honest, just like, what is my weekly meal plan for my teenager so she won't complain? But also, how can we have big impact with small stories? It's, to me, it's like it's a little bit of a conundrum, but it's like super critical, but also really fun to try to figure out. It's the kind of puzzle that I feel like takes up a lot of a lot of my day. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dal. And last but certainly not the least, we have Nikki Yaboa.
Hi, everyone. I am Nikki Yaboa. I am an assistant professor of playwriting at the University of Washington. I use she, her pronouns. I'm trying to recall what all the prompts were. What am I working on? Yeah. Yes.
Also, like
I
if
do
there's a question or something that has been remaining or
Ah,
staying with you, but you can also talk about your work.
I do documentary theater work, which is how I got into oral history. So I've kind of never been taught like the traditional practices to begin with, and have kind of worked in collaboration with people that, like the ones that you've just met, that have felt kind of on the fringes of, or questioning, or revisiting the practices that they've learned. What I'm thinking about right now, well, I am a mom now to 2-month-old twins. And so the questions are very simple, like, did they poop? What's the consistency of their poop? How much are they eating? Is it enough? It's nothing meta right now. It's all very much grounded in everyday.
Very material.
Very material.
Thank you so much, everyone, just for sharing a little bit about yourselves. So we thought, when we were thinking about this event, we were thinking a little bit about structure. And I think in some ways we wanted to model for everyone, like how our group has been gathering and meeting this past year. And that is, with a set of questions, but also so providing kind of a skeletal structure, but also allowing the conversation to go where it will and asking each other questions. So I think that's actually what we're going to do here. I also just, again, welcome all of you. If you want to share thoughts or anything collectively in the chat, please do. And I'll try to share that during our conversation. And of course, if you need to use, the restroom or grab something to eat, or if you're laying down, that's all great. So just be as comfortable, as possible. So I think the question that we might start with, and that makes a lot of sense, is, based on everyone's location, what is community-centered memory work? What does it mean to you? What does it feel, look, and sound like? So I don't know if there's someone who wants to start us off, and then we can just be in conversation. Does anyone want to start us off?
I can jump in.
Okay, great, Ella, thank you.
So again, I'm Ella, and I work at Voice of Witness. So for me, we work with a lot of communities nationally, and some like more in like specific local communities, including the Bay Area, but also beyond. We have a new book coming out in June that's all about stories of migration and movement in Appalachia. So it's like a very local, specific community. But I think when I think about community-based storytelling and memory work, there's an Arundhati Roy quote that we use a lot in our Voice of Witness trainings, and I think that really drives how I think about this work. And the quote is, "There's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard." And that makes me just think about like who, we think about storytelling and voices, like who is not really being heard, who is being invisibilized, and what are the different dynamics and forces and systems that are affecting who is getting the platform to speak, really, and who like we're not getting to hear from. So thinking about, what is being misunderstood, mischaracterized, invisibilize stereotypes, and then really thinking about those really intentionally and pushing back against those things. And a way we think about our work at VOW is that we are forcing space for people to be heard. So for me, I think about collective memory work as asking those questions, really like, interrogating who has not been given a chance to speak, and then be able to provide space for people to just truly be themselves and to not have to share their thoughts and their memories and their stories according to like a particular agenda that's being enforced by somebody else, but really just forcing space for people who don't get that platform for a variety of reasons to be able to be heard and to be just their full dynamic selves, and not have to fulfill any kind of like other expectation or anything like that. So really allowing people and providing the support for people to just tell their stories in their own words. So that's how I sort of approach that work. And maybe I'll call on Dow, my wonderful, wonderful colleague, if we're popcorning it. I'll nominate Dow to go next.
Well, can I, before Dow
Oh,
goes,
sure.
can I,
Yeah.
yeah, no, this is just like a bridge to Dow. I mean, obviously, I've been in conversation with both you, Ella, and Dow, and I know Val's work and admire it so much. I mean, one thing that I would love to hear maybe throughout, it doesn't have to be right now, it could be sort of threaded throughout the conversation. I mean, I just had this conversation with someone at, in another space about the ways in which our stories are always already mediated. And by that, I mean, these aren't, even when we're creating spaces, where we're explicitly addressing, different systems of violence and harm, right? That has shaped like which narratives are amplified, which aren't. Even as we're holding space, there's still power relations, right? There's always going to be power relations no matter what. So how do we remain vigilant is not the right word, but how do we acknowledge that, right? That there's power is always going to be part of the system. There are ways in which we're always going to be quote unquote framing the work, even if we're also explicitly contesting, right? The kinds of power structures. So it's just like a question that I have for both of you as part of VOW, because this is the work that you're doing, but also sort of everyone else who's sort of working here, with memory and different kinds of stories.
Maybe I'll just, my quick thought on that is that I totally agree. It's something that I think is often like pitched or like presented as like, oh, an afterthought to kind of think about the ethics of storytelling, when really I think it's like the guiding principle to always be asking and interrogating, asking ourselves, like, how are we truly showing up from community? Both you and Crystal and Fanny wrote a wonderful article around narrator compensation, which I think is so important. And so that's a great example of just like continuing to, because you're right, power is always present. So just really continually and intentionally examining that and asking, how can we best show up for our narrators as they're showing up for us with their stories as well.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in just to say, I think our approach is really about being as transparent as possible about those power dynamics and, the positionality of you as the interviewer. I mean, there's so many good intentions that many people come into this work with. And I think maybe one of the things that is really useful to remember is that even if people aren't going to talk about or say things that necessarily will back up, say, your thesis or hypothesis, it's actually that process and that relationship that allows there to be space for discovery within a conversation. And that's going to depend a lot on, who are you when you show up? Why should I trust you with my story? I mean, there is an intense history of extraction, right? And I'm not just talking about in terms of news stories or features, drop in kind of journalism where people are only interested in a soundbite. They talk to somebody, something's happened to them, but you think about like the difference in approach where you would never ask somebody who's just been through a traumatic experience, how did that make you feel? I mean, I think as oral historians, we know that that's the last question you'd want to ask. And that in fact, it's through the stories about mundane things that happen, the smaller aspects of, you know, what is it that people remember about the smells or what they saw when they woke up, or, you know, what it was like to attend the school dance. Those types of stories can sometimes be the spark that gets to deeper, more insightful, you know, because for a lot of people, having someone ask a question and be really present and listen is actually one of the best things that we can bring to a conversation as well. I'll just start there. I mean, I really
Yes.
would love to hear what other people say, of course.
Thank you so much, Dal and Ella. Are there others who want to jump into the conversation? So I posted the question in the chat. So what does community-centered memory mean to you? What does it feel, look, sound like? Fanny, I see you that you've, oh, Fanny and Nikki. Fanny and then Nikki.
So for me, community-centered has meant adapting consistently, often, to the needs of the narrator. Like just because I've been working with documenting immigrant stories, I've had to adapt to their level of comfort in giving and contributing their story to an oral history project. For example, one of the first projects that I worked on was with Aman, who was detained at the US-Mexico border with her daughter, and a Salvadoran immigrant from, and she didn't want me to photograph her. So I didn't photograph her face, but I asked her if I could photograph her hands as I was interviewing her. So like for me, when a door closes, literally like other opportunities open for being able to be present for the narrator in how they want to be seen and heard and shared with the world. It is a very scary process to tell your story. I have had this quandary of like, how much of me should I give and how much exposure do I give society about who I am and my ethics and my core values? So I can imagine how somebody who has been marginalized, who has been hurt by state-inflicted violence will have another level or of concern about how much of their story to put out there. So I think for me, it's like constantly being aware that I need to adapt and being comfortable with that adaptation or that pivoting. And part of that is also understanding and asking about and learning to understand people's motives for participating in an oral history project. They have ulterior motives for wanting to participate, and respecting those is an important part of acknowledging people's dignity, I think.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Fanny. I have some follow-up questions, but I want to also shift to Nikki.
Yeah, when you asked that question around what community-centered memory work means to me, I've been thinking a lot recently about the fact that I turned to oral history or storytelling more broadly as a way of making community. I'm a person that's moved around my whole life. And the first oral history I ever did was with my grandmother in Ghana, and I left when I was 6. So it was this attempt at building that bridge to community that first brought me to this field in the first place. And I've also found just in reflecting, it wasn't intentional, but every time I move to a new place, I start an oral history project about the place. And so it has definitely been like storytelling is my my entry point into making community. And the more I think about that, the more I start to think about, so what kind of community do I want to make through my practice? And I don't have answers, and that shifts for every community, but I feel like if I center that question more in my practice moving forward, it would guide me, right? It'll kind of guide the ways in which I approach the process. If I'm thinking about what kind of community I'm trying to make in the process.
I really appreciate that, Nikki, sort of thinking about community not as separate from practice, but actually, and community can mean such different things to people. It can be, our given families or chosen families, or it can be, the neighborhoods that we live in, or the specific people that we belong to, right? So I know that has, variable meanings, but thank you. Others, Trey, Rochelle, or Matt.
Yeah, I
Oh,
wanted to jump
Rochelle.
in. Yeah, because both what everybody said, but especially what Nikki and Fanny was just talking about. So like my oral history practice, I didn't get a master's in oral history. I didn't go to school for it. How I learned oral history was from talking to my family, being an organizer, being a neighbor, being a daughter, in all of the worlds that I'm in. And so for me, the work that I do as an oral history educator is not necessarily about like constantly collecting stories, but it's actually really been a lot of the guiding questions have been like, how has oral history and storytelling as a process actually lived within communities long before an actual interview and continues to live after the interview as well? And so for me, like community-centered memory work is actually thinking about that whole the longevity of memory. It's like not only the actual thing that we collect, but it's also how do the relationships and how does the process itself how is that embedded into the community? And then how does that bring about the stories? And then also once the story is collected, how does that process and those relationships continue to actually move through the community? It's not like we collected the memory and we're done and that's it. But for me, community-centered practice is actually being in community, just as Fanny was saying that, with different people coming in and different people having different comfort levels and experience with storytelling, the process always has to be adapted. And that's, what living in community is about. And that's actually where stories come out for me. And that's where I've learned so much. And so there are times when I know I didn't do the right thing to get to this story. And so we adapt and we learn together, and to actually do that process and really kind of pour so much into the relationship, to me, makes the stories even more special, because that means that it's not the only story that will ever come out, but it's actually kind of setting the stage for the future and really acknowledging that these stories continue to live on, whether you're there to interview them or not.
I love that the stories are living, right? They're not sequestered to recordings or transcripts. Thank you so much for that, Rochelle. Trey and Maz, I want to make sure that both of you have a chance to share too. Trey?
I'll just jump in a little bit. I mean, I love what everyone is saying. I think for me, as a Cherokee Nation citizen, I mean, the memory work, I mean, tribal sovereignty is, a principal concern on so many levels. I mean, one, just the act of telling a story is an act of defiance and resistance. I mean, I was just asked to review a textbook the other day, and for a publisher, and it was like, at some point it was just like, just don't publish this. It's just so embedded in stereotypes. And so for me, the oral history process is about reclaiming space in some regards, and about the resistance towards that stereotyping and these, narratives. For Cherokee people, we've been in a state of contact for over 500 years, and I think ultimately it's also about health, it's about healing. And I like what Rochelle was saying about this, you're a part of this continuation process and a setting for the future. I thought that was really cool. And so I think there's an urgency for us too, because a lot of the, a lot of the memory work is embedded in language. And, that's a slippery slope for us as a community. And so it's complicated and hard and messy, and it's also vital. So I don't know, I don't have a clear thought there.
No, that's so powerful. And before we transition to Mads, I want to ask you, Trey, can you say, because Trey actually spoke in one of the oral history courses that I taught maybe a few years ago, and I remember you speaking about the role of language. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of those complications, and also, I remember I forgot whether I think a student asked about whether these stories that you were a part of in terms of gathering, if they're accessible to, folks outside the community, right? Or if they're going to be translated from Cherokee to, to English, and sort of you were engaging with my students. So I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about language.
Yeah, I think it's just, it's pretty complicated, like, the community I work in, which is the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, we're at 148 speakers left, all over the age of 65. So I mean, memory work is, it's urgent. It's like we got to do it. And so it's about preservation and revitalization. And yeah, I think access for us is always going to be sort of complicated. I work at a university, so when I got that grant, started that work, they immediately wanted access to the materials, and it was like, I'm not doing this for you. And I don't know that you'll ever have access to it, and that was like, they were like, ah. But I think it's, we have to tell our stories for ourselves first. And, that just isn't an utmost priority for us. And so the language conversation is just really complicated because it's urgent. It's vital. There's so few speakers left. And a lot of people want access to it that don't necessarily need to have access to it.
Thank you so much, Trey. I know we'll segue into a conversation around audiences, right? And sort of who are in relationship with, who do these stories belong to? Should they be public? But I want to make sure that Mads also has a chance to share before we move on.
Yeah, no, thank you. I really appreciate what everyone has to share, and also just the overlaps, because I think much in relationship to what Dow was talking about and Rochelle, right, is like a lot of these like everyday moments that I'm really sitting with. Like, I also feel really lucky that I was trained by Crystal and many other practitioners that like have already really challenged and diverged what oral history might typically be. And so that's kind of where I was coming from as well. But I think about my grandmother, and just she was one of the first kind of more quote unquote official oral histories that I had done and recorded. And I think it was really interesting because after doing that oral history with her, she's already told me stories prior to that, and she'd continue to tell me stories after that. But I think the most like resonant moments were the like when we were like watching TV together and we were kind of sitting in silence, and she'll like these kind of moments will like pique her memory, like, oh, we'll be watching TV and she's like, oh, that person's selling fish. I used to sell fish. They're poor like me, or things like that. Or these, I often think about, when she was cooking for me and she was telling me about who taught her how to cook this dish. And I don't know, it just made me, I think it's those everyday moments where I think become most memorable, I think, to me. And it also is very clearly memorable for her as well, because it's like something that she does every day for and with me. And yeah, I just recall a couple of conversations with some other friends as well who are Khmer, and I think between Viet and Khmer community, Southeast Asian, oral history can, widely differ, because I think a lot of my Khmer friends happen to talk about the massive, or not massive, I think just the challenging of sitting with silence oftentimes, where a lot of their families refuse and just don't feel ready to talk. And so how can we still understand that as a part of that history as well, right? And so it's like, what are these things that my friend was talking about? Oh, every day my mom wakes up and she lights incense, she dusts off the altar, she'll like, fix all the photos. And these are these kind of small moments that I think end up, I think for me being resonant in terms of like, there's stories behind why it is that she does each of these things, and trying to understand that, I think sounds much more, or I think for each of us respectively mean much more to us than these kinds of like broader narratives that are trying to be like extracted, I think, from these stories, right? And the storytellers. Yeah, that's just what I was thinking about.
Thank you so much, Matt. While you were speaking, I was just pulling this really amazing book by Yiding Trung called Lambridge. And I know the US version is going to be published by Duke in the fall. This is the British version. And Yiding passed away, gosh, I think a year and a half ago now, very young, in her early 40s. But, she talks about, she was born in Cambodia. She talks about the genocide, and there's this really powerful chapter where she talks about silence and the kapok tree and the ways in which the community that she belongs to, would often, including, she was talking about her father, sort of the planting of these trees that witnessed genocide, right? And the ways in which they were the silent witnesses, and what does it mean to be in community also with the non-human, right? Sort of as sort of witnesses to these kinds of atrocities, right? So thank you so much for sharing that. I think if it's okay, I want to segue into the second question. And, the thing that I want to say too is that this is not like a, thank you for sharing that, Matt. This is not like a, we can go back to this first question. This is just, again, a kind of entry point into being in conversation with one another. So we can also, free flow a little bit, right? I want to offer the question, in the chat. I would also welcome the audience. If there's anything that emerges for you, a thought, a word, image, questions, please feel free to share that also in chat. So this is a second question that we've been thinking about. So I'll read it out loud. Who are the people's communities you are in relationship with? And how has your situated local work shaped, changed, challenged the ways in which, if you were trained to do memory work, how has it challenged sort of that particular training? And maybe this is just a chance for folks to like really locate their work and maybe give specific examples and different challenges that you've been sort of working through. And if it's okay, I'm going to actually start with Rochelle, if that's okay, if you feel comfortable, and then we can sort of be in open conversation with one another.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, that caught me off guard. I mean, that makes sense from my last answer. So this totally makes sense. With Chinatown Records, so I think I forgot to mention this in my intro, but I am based on Lenape land in what is now New York City's Manhattan's Chinatown. And so a lot of my work really centers around organizing here as a neighbor, as an oral history educator, as a DJ. And so, yeah, a lot of my oral history practice, as I mentioned, I did not learn it from going to school. I had to do a lot of trial and error with my own family and with my neighbors here in Chinatown. And those are the people that I am constantly looking to, not only to build up my oral history practice, but actually these are people who are in my life every day. And what I really came to realize in living next to them all the time, just like Mads was talking about, is these kind of tiny moments in between, way before an interview happens, way even before we think about an interview, but so many stories, so many lessons. And so what I really started to realize was that, you know, we can all be storytellers. We can all be historians. Everybody around me has been holding this little piece of the puzzle. And so a lot of my work as an oral history educator has really been about working with community groups, working with students, working with just your regular person who wants to be able to have conversations with the people they love, with the people around them, and really hoping that folks can realize that, you know, if you're saying hello to if you're having a conversation with your grandma at the dinner table, that can lead to oral history. In fact, it might already be oral history. And so much of what I learned to build into my oral history practice is learned from being at the dinner table with my family. It's being on the couch and also having these hard conversations with my family and with my neighbors, many of whom I don't know if our values totally line up, but there has to be some sort of middle ground. And it takes time, and it's not always going to be like rainbows and sunshines to figure out what that middle ground is. But so much of my work has been really informed and grown by the people around me. And so I'm really thankful that all of these people around me are not only down to help me grow this, but actually really challenge the process all along the way, because for me, that's honestly how I've been learning how to do all of this.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. Not to put you on the spot, but do you want to share a little bit about the ways in which you're using records and music? Because I think it's just such a beautiful, you know, music as actually a form of storytelling, but also embedding that into the kind of practices that you do.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that I really started to realize, especially with my own family, like I'm gonna be very specific with my dad, is that he's still pretty stoic guy. And so I remember the first few times as I was really diving into oral history, wanting to learn more about my dad and asking these big questions. And the answer was always like, no, I don't really want to talk about that. And it wasn't until 2020 when I inherited his record collection. I stumbled upon his record collection in our childhood home, and we were flipping through the record collection together, and he pulled out one of the records, and he just started telling me about how this was the record that he listened to when he first moved here to the US. He was so lonely and missed all his friends, missed his family, and it just spilled, and like so much of his personal history came spilling out because he saw this record, because he heard this song again. And so Chinatown Records has been really built around that moment of now, you know, I've been inheriting all of these family record collections from my neighbors, from my family, all across the country, and using and from this, I've also become a DJ. One of my neighbors also gave me his grandfather's collection, his turntable, his mixer, and said, now you can DJ for everyone. And so have been DJing this music with Chinatown block parties, at different living room listening events, and using these songs kind of as portals. These songs that you never like realize how deeply embedded they are in your bones until you hear the first few notes again. And it's been a really beautiful way for folks to kind of enter into the past and also bring folks along with them. And it's been feeling a lot more accessible and approachable because it doesn't start with hard questions. It starts with a song that is really special to them. And it's almost as if the song kind of takes them back in time and they're taking me along with them. So, so much of the work with Chinatown Records is not just about collecting the records, but it's actually thinking about how these records, how this song can also be a historical record itself, but also encourage us to actively record together, actively tell these stories that these songs remind us of.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. We appreciate that. Others want to jump in? Fanny, go ahead.
I think someone already mentioned, I think it was Trey, about how when I entered oral history, I think I got the sense from academia that I needed to figure out who my audience was for oral history, and that audience was singular. And inevitably that audience led back to academia. So I think in the process of doing community-centered work, I've started to realize that oral history can and maybe should have multiple audiences. And as Trey said, perhaps the first audience is the people who contributed their story. And so I think for me, I wish one question that I get asked a lot is, where are you going to archive? Or what format is this going to take? Or what product are you going to create with this? I wish they would instead ask, how have you built solidarity? How have you built trust? How have you like stayed attuned to the collective memory of this work? I think that's much more substantial and needed. And that is what most of the narrators that I've worked with worry about the most. And so that's what I think about when I'm thinking about relationships. I think first and foremost, the relationship I'm building with narrators, both as a contributor of their story, but they are audience as well. And that's where I've started to think about what are the needs of narrators for contributing their oral history? Like, how do they want it disseminated, and what need comes along with that dissemination? And that's where, like, I've started to think about oral history as needing an extension. Like, we need to think about applying oral history to something that narrators need. Yeah.
Did you want to, Fanny, thank you so much for that. Did you want to give an example of how, like, the project that you've been working on, or projects, and sort of just sort of situate what you just said within a specific project or context?
When I started interviewing families that were separated at the border, their children had been essentially kidnapped by the US government. The parent had been deported back to their home country. The child remained in the US. Neither child or parent knew where each was. And so when I started talking to parents, it was over the phone. They couldn't see my face. I couldn't see their face. And so I needed to figure out a way quickly to use voice and sound to build a relationship with them and to build solidarity. And so they needed their story to be disseminated because they needed to be reunified with their child. Now, I had to do a lot of work in terms of like reminding parents, just because I collect your story and document it and record it doesn't mean that it will lead to you being able to see your child and reuniting, but we can certainly make efforts. So to advocate for that. So we wrote an op-ed, for example, for the Washington Post, advocating for reunification and permanent status for families. We use the stories of parents in excerpted clips from oral histories to present to a hearing with for parents and with Department of Homeland Security Secretary. And families were also able to use excerpts of their oral history for a call for public comment from the White House, again, advocating for reunification and most importantly, to be able to stay in the US after reunification, to be able to stay in the US permanently. We haven't succeeded in those. There have been some gains, and I can go into that at a later time. People can ask me, but you know, we needed to use the stories to make sure the public did not forget that more than 5,000 parents were separated from their children in a terrible, terrible policy that hurt many and will hurt them for generations.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Fanny. And policy that has like such a deep history and that continues, you know, in different ways. Did others want to also share, engage with this question?
Yeah, I want to just really follow up and affirm everything that Fanny just said. And I think that really resonates for me, especially doing community partnership work, a voice of witness. And so we've just one example is like we've worked a lot in immigrant justice work, and some of our community partners are organizations that advocate for immigrant justice and for the rights of immigrants and refugees, especially to like have a path to permanent residency for some folks, especially folks who have like temporary protected status. And we've done a number of like narrative workshops with people to share their story. And I think in terms of like how, you know, often like, you know, I really appreciate what Fanny was saying about like, it's not the focus on a narrative product, right? And I think there's all sometimes these rules that can be helpful of like, you know, having X amount of time and really like sitting in and like really, you know, have it only like one-on-one or like very few people and in a space where it's like quiet, but also like respecting that like narrators have limited time and like what they're really interested in is like, how can I share my story for this campaign? You know, like they have this, it's such an act of bravery to share and encourage to share their immigration story. Might be the first time they've shared it, but really honoring that narrators are like, I want to share my story because I want it to be part of this campaign. I want it to be able to, you know, help like to fight for our rights and stuff. And so being flexible, like, okay, like we're not going to do like a traditional like interview format, but we're going to work with like the limited time and capacity the narrators have so that we can get, even if it's a short kind of story and almost looks like a sound bite, but really like we still tried to go as deep as we can and like work together, like as a, you know, in a community setting for people to feel really comfortable about this, what they're going to put forward. And it wasn't just a like, you know, a journalist who they don't know on this, you know, during a rally asking them something, but we were like, okay, like we all work together to like have like a narrative that they're comfortable putting out. And also that was something they could hold on to. And when folks were planning to like be part of a demonstration, be part of like this like long walk that was like a demonstration for immigrant justice, like we were also like, this story is going to be a tool for you so that if a journalist like it talks to you, like you'll feel comfortable, like you have this and like it's yours, and we've all together like worked with you and support you and being able to have your story to share. So I think just and so maybe that, I don't know if like, is that still oral history necessarily? Maybe it's like actually like, you know, advocacy storytelling. So I think being flexible, like maybe it's not even oral history, but like that's what the community members really want and need from us as folks who are supporting storytelling right now. And so just really honoring that, and that's like, it doesn't have to look a certain way, and the process you can really adapt, but just honoring what community members need. Because I think the biggest thing that comes up with our community members often, they're like, I want to tell this story because I want it to be able to have an impact. You know, I think that's there's also so many other reasons too, like relationship building and healing, but that's why people want to share their story more often than not, is because they want it to make a difference. So honoring that, adapting to however we can make that happen.
Thank you so much, Ella, for sharing that. And, you know, Dow, if it's okay, would you, I'm sorry, I know you want to also share, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, I know I had emailed you and Ella, if you could talk a little bit about the Country Queers project as well that Dow has been working on.
Sure. So Country Queers has existed for about 10 years, almost 11 years now. And it started out as a project for Ray Geringer to find community. Ray is somebody who basically found himself in wanting to move home to a small town, rural kind of place in West Virginia, but feeling that from the time that they came out, that that place was no longer for them. And trying to reconcile this deep need to come home, but also not go back into the closet. And, you know, trying to find others who had done it before. And they set out on a road trip with like a flip phone and a paper atlas, and started interviewing. Wasn't trained in oral history or audio production, and, you know, collected almost 100 deeply moving, historical, connected stories from all over, you know, the West, the South, all in small towns and rural areas where people were not just surviving, but actually thriving. You know, in the context of now, a wave of, you know, horrible legislation, attacks, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's lots to say about it, but eventually I found them on Instagram, and was super intrigued by this project. And, you know, part of my work has always been thinking about who gets to tell these stories, and how can I, from my small perch in a semi-institutional place, help that, support that. Because I think for most marginalized folks, the things that we don't have access to are the very things that you need to do projects like this, to do collective, communal, oral history, storytelling projects. You need time, you need money, you need support, and most of those things are not available to us. So how, you know, for me, a lot of the time, it's about trying to figure out how can I connect people to those resources that they need to be able to do that. And in Ray's case, at the time that I reached out to them, they were basically about ready to give up. They had been burnt out on, you know, several years of doing this DIY podcast. It's beautiful. You should listen to it if you get a chance. They made so many discoveries, you know, found this beautiful archive. And the original dream had always been to have a book. And I was reaching out to say, how can we help make that happen? And it's been, you know, a wonderful kind of collaboration from that point on. I don't know, Ella, if you can like throw up some of the photographs about, you know, the process. And this is like an early round of cover concepts. We're not, you know, keep this here, but it's just to give you all an idea, like for it to go from being this one person project dream to, you know, having a team of folks working on this podcast, which was also very community centric, to it, you know, living as a book. I think one of the crucial things that Ray mentioned was, aside from the kind of moral support and backing for it, that they found such renewed sense of community in meeting people like Fanny and Ella, who kind of get the kind of work they had been trying to do for so many years and doing it in isolation. And now having, you know, folks that they could bounce ideas off of and see an actual, sometimes the product is important, you know, and for lots of folks, I don't know if this is true for other people, but I have found in most of my conversations, when asked, what do people want to do with their work? They want a book. And there is still like a huge amount of legitimacy and respect. You know, folks that we're working with around housing justice, people who are unhoused, homeless, have often said, I want something that shows me being taken seriously, being listened to, having a certain amount of dignity. Those are things that we've all been cut off from. And so, yeah, sometimes a product or a book is really important, and it can come in many different forms. That's part of what I love about our storytelling kind of work, is that it's really applicable to film, to, you know, audio. It's the stories are the heart of it. And so, yeah, I don't know if there's other questions
I mean,
specifically.
no, I mean, Dal, it also reminds me, oh, thank you for this visual, wonderful way. You know, I was thinking, I was
That's one of the
talking,
narrators
oh, that's
from.
one of the narrators, so apologies. Yeah. Oh, look at the t-shirt. Love it. You know, one thing that I want to say is, like, we could think about speaking with my one of, you know, a dear friend, but also colleague at UCR, Latifa, and we were talking about how books are not, you know, they're objects, but they're also portals, right? They're ways in which we can be in conversation with each other. It's like the process of making something is a kind of community building process, right? So I'm conscious about time and make sure that Nikki and Mads and Trey also have a chance to share a little bit before we segue into a discussion or a conversation with the audience.
I'll share really quickly. I mean, it's not that much different from what Dow, Rochelle, and Fanny have all shared already. But I think one of the biggest things that I've started moving into my personal project, which is my dissertation, is like, what does my family want from this project? And I think for broader context, I'm really thinking about, you know, illness and sickness narratives and stories that I've moved across my family. And so, but also kind of in the broader Vietnamese community. And lately my dad's been like, how do you talk to so-and-so? Yeah, like they had to go to this doctor appointment, they got, you know, polyps and they had this and they had that. Make sure you go talk to them so that you understand what's going on. And so a lot of, and based off kind of just like colloquial and anecdotal kind of experiences across the Vietnamese American context and community in Orange County in relationship to the emergence of the Vietnamese American Cancer Foundation, is like a lot of resources are often shared by word of mouth and by, you know, the trust of like community, like trusted community members or friends and family. And so thinking about how folks want to, and if they feel compelled to share, like how much of their stories is really just for themselves and for their own families, right? And how they can document their own kind of health histories with each other, and it as a way of thinking about, you know, healthcare practice or preventative practice, right? And then another area that I've also been working on is with my other hat at Viet Rainbow Orange County, where I think we've really just started to open up like this non-traditional kind of, you know, oral history. And this is really taking from New York, New York City's Transit Oral History Project, and how they really are decentering this kind of typical life history and kind of moving with the queer life history, and that like queer life starts differently for many of us. And being able to like oral history doesn't have to be just reserved for, you know, elder folks in the community, but it can be for anybody. And so allowing and experimenting with like doing an oral history with one of our young people who was had supportive family and was able to transition early in his life, and talking about his experiences with that. And also one of them being from like a parent and her talking about what it means to start raising queer children and being in a queer family, and what it means to like discover or try to invent new words in Vietnamese to call family members that aren't just you know, gendered and things like that. So it's like, you know, thinking about the kinds of resources that they're hoping to, like they're asking for resources in the oral histories, but also providing them at the same time. So yeah, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Maz. And there's so much I could say about the wonderful work that you've been doing. But also Trey and Nikki, I want to make sure that both of you have a chance to share.
I think what I want to say really echoes. I mean, I feel like I'm in the right community listening to you all. A lot of the questions you've asked yourself and have worked through are questions that I've also that have also kind of framed my own career. In regards to what you're asking about, you know, how my work has changed or been challenged in relation to how I've been trained. I think that, you know, I was trained to like either write an academic article or make theater from the work. And ideally, theater will happen in a theater space, in a venue. And I think when you start listening for what people want their stories to do or how they want their stories to live in the world, when you actually start listening to how they want it to move in the world, you have to adapt. You can't go according to your training because that does not reflect it doesn't always reflect how people want their stories to function in the world. And so I've had my work, shown in churches and community centers, at rallies. I'm currently developing an app for the work I'm doing with Seattle protesters from the occupation of a neighborhood in Seattle during the pandemic. And so because I could tell that they were uncomfortable with their stories in a theater space, and because the occupation happened on the streets, it didn't feel right to have it play or to have it performed in a venue like that. And so now I'm working with a collaborator to develop an app that will allow you to walk the site and hear their stories being performed. And so I know not, like I can barely function with my computer, I am not the app sort. And so, but a willingness to adapt, I think, comes with this work. If you are intending on doing it ethically, and if you're intending on really listening to the stories, and really listening for how people want them to move in the world.
That's so amazing, Nikki. I'm going to have to follow up with you on that as well. I know we were in conversation about the work that you've been doing in Seattle as well. And Trey, did you want to share before we segue into a conversation with the audience?
Sure. I think that let's see, just this question about how is the local challenge the ways you were trained or taught? And I think, I don't know, in multiple ways. When I did the Snowbird Day School project, because it was in the language itself, I wasn't necessarily, I was trained to be in the lead, to be the main collector or whatever terminology. And, that was tricky because really I was just there listening. The elders were speaking to each other and I didn't even understand a lot of at times what was being spoken. So that was a challenge. And I think the other thing was, being trained in a settler colonial institution. Just the inherent understanding of knowledge and community is totally at odds with how we understand ourselves as a community. And so navigating that was always, I think, particularly, tricky. And I was trained to write a book. And we did produce a book, but it turned into a community-based yearbook of digitized photos. And my name is not anywhere on that thing. And so I know that my peers were like, well, your name should be on it so that you could use it for promotion, tenure, blah, 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 blah. And that was just nothing that was a part of that project, and that was hard for people to understand, so.
Could you share a little bit about the project with the Snowbird project in case folks might not be familiar with it?
Yeah. So, this is, I don't know, can you see this?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the book I'm talking about. Basically this project came about. This was a Bureau of Indian Affairs day school that was located in one of the Cherokee communities. This is different than the boarding schools where they ship kids thousands of miles away. Kids at these schools got to go home, if there's a saving grace to it. This community had actually fond memories of this school. And so some of the elder women, they wanted to have a reunion. And so just a bunch of us were getting together, eating as Cherokee people do. And we're like, man, this is a great opportunity to record some of these stories. And so that's what we did. And, there were a few photos. And so we said, maybe we should digitize these photos and save them. And they were like, well, you might only get like 20 or 30 total. And we ended up with like 457. And then we started interviewing the elders. And what's cool about it is I think we have like 30 interviews that are in the Cherokee language. And so it became a language preservation project. And really the community was pretty divided because of tribal politics. And we didn't even really anticipate that, but we did eventually have a reunion. And this is the picture of it. You know, most of these people are language speakers, and we did a little documentary. We showed it to them, and we gave them these books. And what was really cool is the elders got up and they treated it like they were in school, and they went around and had each other sign their yearbooks and stuff. And that was just, it was a project really that ultimately became about healing on so many different levels. But I think it challenged almost every way in which I was trained as an academic.
Thank you so much, Trey. It's such a powerful project. So I know we have like 10 minutes left just to be in conversation with the audience. As you can see, this is just like a snippet of the many different kinds of conversations that were had, this past year. And I wish we could share that with all of you too, but hopefully it, gives you at least just like a taste of the different things, different practices that we were also sharing with each other. And Dow, I love what you say here. Our motto is move slow and heal things. So we want to be in conversation with all of you and maybe learn about the work that you're doing, but any specific questions or comments. And feel free to share it in the chat. You can also unmute yourselves if you want, whatever feels the most comfortable. Any questions or comments? Well, any questions or comments from our participants actually, or anything that you want to share that you feel like you maybe didn't have a chance to say, or questions for each other?
One question that I get asked a lot, but I don't think I've asked our group. But I know intimately, which is that a lot of this work requires a lot of effort and time and emotion. So how do you all practice self-care in this work? I don't think we've talked about that yet in the group, Crystal, but it's come up.
Yeah. And I know one of my wonderful collaborators, Twee, is actually here, who's at UCLA, and Twee's hi Twee. So this has been such a rich and generative space. Thank you for inviting us, and some of my UCLA students are here. Great, so wonderful seeing you. We're working together next year for the ECHRI initiative, and we were talking a lot about care for memory workers. How do we, hold these stories? Did anyone want to share anything? I know I saw a few other hands too. Amy, I think, had a question, someone else, but
No, that's fine. That's a great, such an important question. If there's time, I can ask a question, but y'all should go ahead.
did anyone want to respond? Trey, did you want to respond?
Oh, I just love that question so much. And yeah, that I really didn't, I don't know that I had a self-care routine when I went into that project, but it was so emotional. And then to be honest, as Rochelle was saying, your relationships continue. And for us in that project, we have lost a lot of the elders that were a part of that project due to COVID or health-related issues. And so, the mourning of that, and just that sense of loss, and in our community anyways, they say every time an elder passes, it's like a library is burned down. And probably a third of those speakers we've lost, and so I just appreciate the question. I think I'm much more prepared as a human being now to go into that work. What's interesting for me, just really quickly, I don't want to take up too much time, but in nonprofit work that I'm doing, we were just having this question because we're really building it from scratch. And so how can we build an organization that our ancestors would recognize? And man, that's a really part of that is like our mental, spiritual, and physical well-being. Anyways, something we're wrestling with.
That's so powerful, Trey. Thank you so much for sharing that. And maybe in relationship to that, I want to share that, like, this has been such an intense, period of grief, I think, for many of us, right? Whether it's personally but also systemically in terms of what's happening on our campuses right now, but, beyond that as well. Something that has helped me a lot is, I was thinking about, and this is more of like a personal loss, right? And I was talking to my family about this, and I lost my dad pretty recently, and one thing that has been really healing for me is actually trying to situate him in a different way in his death, right? And by that I mean he's not only a parent, but he's an ancestor, right? So he's part of this large, this longer lineage of ancestors who have come before him. So it's like, how do I develop a relationship with him as an ancestor, right, versus as a parent? So it's like thinking about, and this is just a way to say, I think there are, that relationships change, whether it's with our narrators or people in our everyday lives. And rather than thinking about those changes as just something that is challenging or different, how do we also sort of create a different kind of relationship or different mode of communication, right? Did anyone want to share sort of?
Yeah, I wanted to share in regards to Fanny's question as well, because it's something I wrestled with when I did the project with mothers who'd lost children to police violence. That destroyed me, and I didn't even understand that it was doing that. So I just became an angrier person. I became a more anxious person. There was just, but I couldn't, if you'd asked me at the time, I would have been like, I'm fine. There's nothing going on. It wasn't until afterwards that I realized the toll it took on me. And so that's when I began to actually think consciously about how to create practices for myself that are healthy as I bear witness to these stories. And some of them I've passed on to students in classes, but I often encourage students to partner up when they're doing oral history stories that are difficult to hear, because you will want someone to process with after. And sometimes that person can be you through journaling, or it can be a therapist, etc. But someone that has actually sat in the same space as you and fully understands what it is that you experienced. And I know I don't often see kind of partnered oral history interview processes, but I have found that when I was working on the project with the protesters about a year or two ago, and I had students partner up to do it, it just kind of allowed them to share the weight. And so whatever that means to you, sharing the weight of hearing heavy stories is something that I have been consciously trying to do, to commit to as a practice. And so it might not be with a person that was in the room with you, but just keeping that in mind. And also stories are meant to be shared. And so, just feeling empowered to acknowledge that these stories now live in your body too. You're a part of them, they're a part of you. And knowing that it comes with the heaviness, and it's okay to kind of share that weight.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Did anyone else want to share? Amy, I don't know if you want to also just share your question and just put it out there. And
I mean, I can just mention it for future conversations, maybe, and Rochelle started to touch on this, but one of the challenges that I have in doing this kind of work is, especially place-based communities, is that those are not singular things. And the question of how are you accountable to a community that has conflicts and divisions within it, and that also have, and Rochelle said, like, maybe you're working with people whose core values don't even align with yours. And so I think when we talk about like community-based oral history, we assume that a community is some kind of thing. And I think we all know that that is not the reality. So it just seems like a juicy conversation to have with this particular group of folks, but maybe for another time.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great question. And Amy, I know you've been playing that role, you know, in multiple ways in terms of holding space and you know, navigating very, very different kinds of alignments in multiple, you know, in different spaces. But I did anyway, you know, we're going a little bit over, but maybe like 3 minutes. Does anyone want to just even address that question, like even if briefly?
If I can speak really quickly about it, I think this is definitely a huge question that I've been sitting with, particularly one in Viet community, as historically and politically so many divisions and conflicting ideologies, I think, emerge oftentimes in talking about like any kind of history. And so engaging elders around history can often be really challenging. I think another thing too is really acknowledging that even though I'm really sitting with this like broader idea of sickness and disability that many might not even identify as disabled, it's still really moving with whatever language I think is emerging in that time and space, I think is how I must really, I think, sit with and contend with that on my own. Like this isn't their labor to hold, but rather me opening space for me to hold with them. And so not really an answer, but just yeah, definitely something I've been thinking with as well. And I think it also presents a huge challenge for me in the writing process afterwards too, that I have to kind of really contend with.
I mean, one thing that I'll say too, Amy, really quickly is that, you know, I've been thinking a lot about that question too. And it's like, how do you create a space where differences can be held and people don't have to be in consensus, you know, so community doesn't have to be about consensus per se, right? And in a lot of ways, that's what solidarity is too, right? In terms of, in some ways, like being in a very different positionality, but being able to have some sort of connection. So it's not really a response, but it's like, I've been trying to think about that ground and that, you know, in terms of how do we hold difference in a space? How do we not necessarily avoid conflict, but navigate it in a way that is like not reproducing harm, which I think can be really challenging. But yeah, I would love to have that conversation with everyone in this space because I think especially at this moment, it's a really challenging question.
Can I jump in with something?
Yeah,
really
of course, Rochelle. Yes.
It actually combines this question from Amy and then Fanny's question before. I've also been thinking a lot about this because you know, a lot of times people come up to me and they're like, oh my God, you work with elders. That's so wholesome and like amazing, family friendly. And was starting to feel the pressure of like, I always have to be like doing this like very sunny kind of community work when in reality, the work is messy. I'm kind of messy and like really, I think one way that I've been finally able to do that self-care is being okay with like allowing the many different selves to be there. It's like I have my wholesome family friendly side. I also have my like, oh my God, I'm just trying to like juggle this. I also have my like very Chinatown, very direct, you know, and that like all of those different selves allow for me to interact with all these different people. And it's very much going back to this idea of like we can adapt and we can bring different parts of ourselves with different people. And it's not always going to be rosy and sunshine in community work. And in fact, if it is, like, that is a red flag to me. And so I think thinking about the fact that we can, like, and I think that's what this group has always kind of been really tethered to, is like there's not one way to do it, and it's definitely not like the always happy way. And a lot of what we've been teasing out in this group is like, what are the many different ways that we can do this? What are the many different selves that we can bring to this work? And yeah, so for me, kind of tying the self-care back into it, it's just been like, it's okay that you're not always like grandma's girl, you know, like you can be messy and be DJing and scratch your records, and you know, it's okay. And that's part of the process too.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. Well, I want to respect everyone's time here, including our speakers. I'm seeing a lot of great chats, and I will download that and share with our participants. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this conversation. Hopefully we can continue to be in touch. I know with our group, we're going to sort of regroup and sort of talk about possible next steps. But thank you so much again for joining us, and I hope you have a beautiful afternoon / evening wherever you might be. And thank you for the chat. Thank you so much, everyone.